Hey, what's up guys? Sir Emanon here, and we are here today with a pretty in-depth discussion on my take and my analysis, at least, on the October 2019 format post-ban list. Now, I have this video titled Preliminary Analysis, and there will be an actual tier list at the end, but keep in mind that, as with all my videos, I like to be very in-depth, thorough, and as detailed as possible. But yeah, even though we've only had a couple of days to really digest this format, I still think there's actually a lot to unpack, simply because, for one, there actually weren't too many monumental changes, but for another, I just simply think that there are actually some interesting shifts that we can see, that on a micro level that could definitely happen, that you guys maybe might want to tune in and listen to my thoughts on, or not. You be the judge. But anyways, we're going to go ahead and talk about the big decks as well as some of the rogue picks, or not necessarily rogue, but tier 2 picks, and then kind of discuss everything from there. So yeah, without further ado, let's just go ahead and get right into it. So starting off with an overall sort of viewpoint and synopsis of the format, at least from my perspective anyway, I think again it's relatively unchanged. There weren't too many big huge swings at the current decks. Just kind of the big problem cards were addressed, but generally speaking, I don't think too many people heavily disliked the format, other than the fact that it's been a bit stagnant for a while. At least that's my personal opinion anyway. But yeah, the format is pretty much in a very similar position to last format, just with some of the hits to the big decks, and some unhits, of course, as always, to the lower tier picks. But yep, the format on a competitive scale is going to be generally the same. We definitely do have shifts in power, like I mentioned earlier, so you are going to see some decks move up and down relative to where they are before, even the ones that weren't directly hit. So a good example of this is Thunder Dragon. I'll touch on this a bit more later, but because of the reduction in Orcust variants, there will be fewer Orcust decks overall in representation, meaning that Thunder Dragon's worst matchup goes down, therefore Thunder's prevalence and potency goes up as a result. So these are the kind of shifts I'm talking about on a micro scale, things that you could definitely see move around based on minute card choices and different interactions between decks in the format. The decks in general are very, very highly adaptable, and you'll see this as a common trend when I go through each deck individually. A lot of decks have been historically this strong, and when I say that the format hasn't been, very much different and it's been stagnant for a while, a huge reason for that is because these decks are able to just simply change their strategies and adapt based on whatever format it is, and based on the other decks that have also been able to adapt. So conversely, because there hasn't been a whole lot of change moving back and forth, there won't be that much net change in terms of the decks that exist, because if all the matchups are the same and they're relatively balanced with one another, then until one deck takes a huge fall, I don't think there will really be a whole lot of a difference. Although we will talk about a deck that might take a big fall, at least in some people's eyes, just a bit later on. And I do think that rogue decks, or tier 2 decks in particular, have the chance to compete in the metagame. We saw decks, for example, like I have on screen, Altergeist, able to kind of just take over in ways that people didn't really expect. We have UDS tops, YCS tops, and a lot of regional event wins. So yeah, this format is probably just a continuation of last format, just allowing the decks that were really just not affected in any meaningful capacity to sort of just rise up on the ladder a bit, which overall will in turn increase their representation and, generally speaking, their top cut performances. We also have a large spread of just combo and control decks, meaning that this kind of fits in for the other rogue decks, like a little bit on the lower tier list, like the hero deck, for example, or some people are talking about BA with Malicious coming back to 3. These kinds of decks that could definitely pop up, especially at a regional level, because of the widespread of combo and control decks. It makes it a lot harder to prepare for the metagame, which means that side decks will have to be super generic, but not specifically for the rogue decks that might show up. So definitely keep that in mind if you are a rogue player this format. Very, very good time for you to be able to show up at regionals and just grab your invite, or maybe even a top 8. And again, like I said, it's just basically a continuation of last format. We know we're not really experiencing too many large shifts, just overall some touch-ups on the bigger problem cards. So I'm going to start off by talking about the decks that were the most affected on the list, and we'll start off with Orcust, which is the most expected one, with Mermaid going to 0. Now, this definitely means that it's going to be stronger as a standalone pure option, meaning that you aren't going to be able to splash in other engines, or rather have other engines splash in the Orcust cards, because, you know, we can't really get into Mermaid as freely anymore, considering it's banned. So what this means is that Ibli is going to not really be a viable option, which kind of is unfortunate because one of the strengths of that card is to be able to play around Nibiru pretty well. You can't really utilize things like board breaker cards, but you can use Scrap Recycler and Mathematician to be able to get your cards into the graveyard, specifically like Harp or Nightmare or things of that nature. And you can also default back to Armageddon Knight and Dark Grepher, just cards that you can use to kickstart your engine in ways that you maybe weren't as previously maxed out on, but now you might have to play more of those starter cards. Additionally, you could opt to play cards like Dangers and just play more of the normal summons, like definitely maxing out a Harp Horror. I think in a pure build is the way to go. And like I alluded to earlier, you're not really going to be able to have a lot of board breakers, at least in my opinion. Like the Go Second variant is definitely still going to be played for sure, just because it was so potent at breaking boards. But the problem now is that you can't convert those into your engine, right? You can't simply go Mind Control, take a guy, Instant Fusion, Restrict, suck up another guy, and then go Phoenix, Mermaid, do the full combo. You kind of have to have your engine cards in tandem with the board breaker cards, creating a kind of a weird balance. The good thing is that a lot of those board breaker cards don't take up your normal summon, so what that means is that you can still accommodate cards like Scrap Recycler, Mathematician, etc. to still be able to get your Orcust cards into the graveyard, as well as being able to have those extra benefits of having things like, Vishuda and maybe like Pankratops or like Super Poly even, those kinds of cards that are going second cards, and just have a more well-balanced list as far as that's concerned, instead of just going like all in and everything else. But an interesting thought here is that maybe Shuttle Fusion will come back to prevalence, as was part of Hani Jahari's top 8 Portland list. That definitely kind of caught a lot of people's eyes as far as a go second blind Orcust list. But because Shuttle Fusion serves as a board breaker as well as a combo starter, it definitely could be a way to utilize that to a higher extent. Additionally, you are very flexible going first or second, and that kind of like goes in tandem with the fact that the go second variants are definitely not dead. Just the fact that you now have options, so you could play like hand traps, you could play again board breakers, or you could play floodgates. We've seen people play summon limit in the main, or like just other generally powerful cards to be blowouts going first or second. We see cards like Nibiru being main decked in Raphael Nevin's top 8, or sorry, not top 8, second place deck list from YCS Fort Worth. When I said top 8, I was still thinking about Hani Jahari's top 8 list. But anyway, yeah, we saw Raphael Nevin pilot Nibiru in the main deck all the way to second place at Fort Worth. So there definitely is some potential there to just have a bunch of blowout cards and then your engine cards and just break boards that way. There is definitely high resiliency and a grind game, as well as increased consistency, which is something I didn't put on the screen here. But you'll notice that Orchestrated Returns have gone up in price quite a bit. And reason being is that card is very good at not only drawing into more potential either starter cards if you're going first, or like interruption cards, or board breakers if you're going second, but it also just puts your Orcusts in grave that maybe aren't as great to draw, like World Wand or Symbol Skeleton, Nightmare, etc. So very useful card, and very versatile. With Symbol Dengirsa Loop, you're able to just continuously either build boards or break them, and we still have like Topologic Bomber Dragon if you want to access that, or like Long Gears Who Sends with Babel. Lots of different options. Crescendo is also very good in the grind game to continue your search, and you just have a lot of flexibility there. And finally, there's a lot of very unique side deck choices. I have Black Garden on the screen. This is all the way back to Nat season, but this is just to kind of showcase the extent to which Orcust can really side interesting and unique tech cards. So if you remember back at Nat season roughly, Black Garden was utilized as a side deck tool against the Sky Striker deck because Mystic Mine was prevalent. So like the Mystic Mine build with set rotation and everything allowed for Black Garden to just be a nice natural inclusion. But we also see things like Artifact Sanctum, not so much in the pure build, but more so in the Cyber Orcust build. But definitely, this could or for sure make its way into the side deck for pure Orcust, or even the main deck in a blind first list, simply because of how powerful it is against a lot of the metagame. So that's all I have to say about Orcust, and now we're going to move into Salamangreat. Just kidding, you guys all got pranked. It's not Salamangreat, it's Sky Striker. I forgot my own outline. I'm a very good YouTuber. No, but for real though, Sky Striker is the other deck that I want to touch on first, simply because it got another very direct hit with Widow Anchor going to 1. But the big takeaway here is that Engage is still at 3, meaning that the deck's identity is still at 3, meaning that the deck is simply able to run as efficiently. You just have to play different cards and sort of tailor the way the deck is run and piloted in different ways. And honestly, with Striker players having played the deck, at least the dedicated ones, for like a year and a half now, it shouldn't be any surprise that the better Striker players can adapt very, very well to pretty much anything until their core card gets hit. So with that being said, Widow Anchor does definitely make an impact. The thing is that it just forces players to play a bit differently, in that you don't have as many long-term stops, and recyclability would just Engage continually getting you more cards that will be reliable disruptions. So you have to play more non-engine cards, things like floodgates, things like hand traps, or board breakers. So for example, you could play more like summon limits, or they can be only ones. You could play strikes and judgments just as generic back row. A lot of powerful traps going first, just to be able to draw into to supplement your engine in in lieu of the Widow Anchors being missing. Also, in a similar vein, you could play hand traps, or sorry, you could play board breakers. So that's what I had here first. So like Mind Control, Cosmic Cyclone. You could play, some people still decided to main Pankratops at certain points during the last format. I remember seeing Joe Bogley's list at a first place regional. He main decked the Pankratops instead of any hand traps, but you could go the alternate line and play hand traps. Another card I didn't mention here is Mystic Mine, but that definitely is a card that Striker can take advantage of, simply because we are in a mix of a combo and control heavy format, like not heavy, but combo and control format, as far as there being a decent share and spread between the two. But regardless, even the control decks are playing a fair bit of monsters, so Mystic Mine is an inclusion to consider. But you also can definitely just fall back on the tried and true hand traps like Ash, Veiler, Crow's picking up in popularity, Bella's pretty good, Impermanence, things of that nature. And there is very, very teeny tiny less bit of consistency due to the fact that Area Zero now has 2 fewer Striker names, unless you want to bump up your copies of Afterburner or Shark Cannon, or even Hercules base. Some people have discussed that 2 might be necessary. It ultimately depends, not entirely sure, but that is some theory that is floating around. Definitely keep that in mind. It is, once again, very adaptable. Just pretty much every single format since its release has been able to see some meta prevalence, including the ones that everyone thought Striker was going to die in, including Kagari going to 1 and the multi-role going to 1. And now we are at Widow to 1, and I still think the deck is capable of surviving this list. But it definitely is much weaker in the extended grind game. So you have 1 Kagari, you have 1 multi-roll, and because of this, now you have to really, really be careful with your multi-roll, especially when it comes to setting Widow Anchor. It's going to be gone for the game after that. So you have to be extremely careful with how you use that card, and you need to be really, really savvy with how you manage your resources in each particular matchup. Because with Striker, you play things like the mirror match far, far differently than you would like a combo deck. So very, very important to keep all these factors in mind when playing. And the final point I have here is that Thunder is definitely going to be a problem for this deck because of now 1 Anchor. So you really have to play cards like the Mind Control, or even like Enemy Controller, just things that can really break apart the boards of Thunder, simply because Colossus is just such a menace for that deck, especially now that you are more reliant on Engage's hitting and Area Zeros being able to fire off. So definitely need to be able to account for that. So the next deck on this list is the aforementioned Thunder Dragon, and this deck I think got a real big benefit. First off, it just didn't get hit at all. I don't think people were foreseeing hits, but some people were still clamoring for maybe Colossus to be hit, or like Hawk in the OCG, but regardless of any of this, none of that happened, and I didn't really think it was deserved anyway. So Thunder Dragon looking very, very good as a solid meta contender for sure. It has very good identity as a control tool. It is obviously Pure Thunder that I'm talking about here. Dimension Shifter I have listed on screen is actually a very powerful card still in this format. With other decks like Orcust and Salamangreat still running around, and even like Striker, like this is the only deck that is tier 1 definitively that can just benefit straight up from this card existing. And there are very few caveats apart from just Shifter's weaknesses itself, in that, obviously it's activation requirement, but as far as Shifter resolving, you're never really going to run into problems with a resolved Shifter if you are playing Thunder, or at least Pure Thunder. So very good as far as just the control elements. Colossus is a very big menace for a lot of decks to deal with, with Salamangreat relying a little bit more on sign-up mining now, as well as Striker, of course. And even though Orcus isn't very much affected by Colossus at all, and it is in fact the deck's worst matchup, the fact of the matter is that there is going to be fewer Orcus decks in the room. You will see Pure Orcust. You might see even more Pure Orcust than previously, but the fact that there is not really going to be Cyber Orcust at all, and very few Lunalight Orcust, at least until we find what the ultimate Lunalight Orcust build is, which I'll get to later, or not Lunalight Orcust, but just Lunalight build is, yeah, you can expect to see fewer Orcusts in the format just as a pure quantity, and because of that, it means that, you aren't going to be playing against this deck that can just Dingusi out your board, or just not have to worry about searching because Harp and Nightmare and Symbol don't care, and all this other stuff. So very big boon and benefit to Thunder Dragon there. Additionally, it just has very good matchups against a lot of the field bar Orcust. Like I mentioned earlier, Colossus just does a lot of things to take care of Striker and Salamangreat and things of that nature. But against like control matchups, the deck is actually also really good because Titan just pops a lot of cards on either player's turn, and it's very hard for a lot of those control decks to actually react to and respond to, especially if they are forced to go second. There's also the disadvantage though of Thunder Dragon, in that sometimes it can run out of gas in the grind game, like in the very late stages. It doesn't excel as much as, say, something like Salamangreat or Orcust. Those decks are very good turns like 4 and 5, whereas Thunder tends to kind of fall off by that point, at least in comparison to those decks. So it can definitely run out of steam, and you have to be able to close out the game, which the deck definitely can do very well. It's just that you have to be cognizant of what resources you have at the time. And the deck can get OTK'd if the board gets cleared. There aren't a whole lot of defensive cards. There are some. There's like hand traps and some back row and things of that nature. But overall, if your board gets cleared and you're against a very heavy combo deck, you can, you can definitely fear getting OTK'd at points. So the next deck to talk about now is finally Salamangreat. So this deck also didn't really get touched, and it's pretty interesting because, like, ever since even the last format, with the Nibiru being released, games are always lasting more than one turn. There's like very few decks that just play out their hand and their opponent auto scoops. I think one of the only real decks was Lunalight Orcust that actually did that last format, but with that being definitely not as prevalent, and even if Lunalight Orcust still stuck around, it would more just look like the regular Orcust boards all the time. Salamangreat will be able to play a lot, and that is very good for this deck because you have 3 Will, which is pretty standard now in this deck, to just be able to keep grinding and grinding. You have Spinnies every turn, you have Jack Jaguars every turn, Sea Archiver is very good as an extender, and you're just able to continually just amass resources to just kill your opponent outright. And the deck is good at breaking boards with Heat Leo for back row and like Stalio to bounce monsters. It's just very overall a versatile deck that can have a lot of tools at its disposal to just straight up, deal with whatever situations, and that goes back to adaptability, which is a very common trend, as you guys are noticing. It has super good matchups across the board. It doesn't really have any bad matchups in particular. Like, the deck is just able to do what it does and play through its opponent's board a lot of the time, and there aren't really a lot of ways that the opponent can deal with everything, as long as the deck gets its proper turn 1 setups. The ability to set Abyss Dweller in particular is very crucial. This card is just a format defining card, and Dweller just is insane against the mirror match. It's very good against Orcust. It's even pretty good against Thunder in some instances, And you can expect to see Dweller being a very, very mainstream line of play, and one that a lot of people will kind of just rush towards, which is a very solid option in this format. Of course, not as good against control decks, but if Sala can survive a turn against control, which they're control decks, so they often will, it can very much play through the board, like I said, with Heat Leos and Phoenixes and things of that nature. It can accommodate a lot of non-engine cards, which is I think one of the deck's biggest strengths even historically before Gazelle and Circle got hit. So like a lot of hand traps. We see Jesse Cotton really innovating the deck with main decked enemy controller and main decked Nibiru as well. Nibiru, of course, just being a card that in the main deck catches a lot of people off guard, and it can be definitely a blowout. And you can afford to play a lot of maybe not as constantly live cards, even if like Nibiru is dead, for example, against like a Draco player or a Striker player. It doesn't always matter as long as you can still get to play, and you can afford to have some dead cards in that deck, which is pretty interesting and pretty cool. But speaking of Nibiru, that is a weakness of this deck, is that it does lose hard to Nibiru without any good safety nets or just ways to really come back unless you are very good at holding resources. Will is a good example of a card that you can hold to play around Nibiru. And there's often a certain point where people will Nibiru, like they'll either do it like on the Stalio to prevent the Jack Jaguar from coming out, or like maybe they'll do it, before the second Sunlight Wolf. Either way, people tend to hold their Nibiru for very specific choke points, quote unquote. So you can kind of capitalize on that in the fact that like there's a lot of other extenders. You got Dangers still running around in some builds, and once again like Sea Archiver and all these other cards. And Flame Buffalo just is really good at amassing you resources throughout the game. And finally, if the board does get cracked, especially turn 1, and the opening isn't the best, like you don't have multiple hand traps or like a Rage Roar setup or things of that nature, it can definitely be game sometimes. Like that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier. If the Salamangreat deck gets to play past turn 1, then it's very good for them. If not, then it's kind of lights out. So that's kind of the biggest con for Salamangreat. Alright, so now I'm going to talk about the other decks that didn't really get too much affected as far as matchups or anything or direct hits. So I would say that Orcust and Striker directly got hit on the ban list, whereas Thunder and Salamangreat got affected by the indirect movements of the other decks. But these decks kind of continue to just do their thing. So we have Altergeist first, which is a deck that honestly just kind of came out of nowhere again. Like we saw it have some success at the premier event level, just kind of out of nowhere. And that's pretty good for the deck considering how flexible it actually can be. So the deck, first off, has really high inevitability. And what that means is that if the engine gets going, there's just so many pluses. You have Melisleek getting you cards and clearing cards. You have Marionetta getting you more cards. You have Hexia getting you more cards. Spoofing getting you more cards. Silk can just clear boards very easily. There's just a lot of very small card generation tools in the actual archetype, which makes it so that like if you see a part of your engine, then that's really good, because that means that you can now draw for turn more sort of non-engine defensive traps, which is very conducive to solving boards and being able to, I guess, adapt for whatever format it is. There's that word again, adapt. Speaking of which, you're able to really just build your deck accordingly to whatever everyone else is playing. And I think because the format is largely unchanged with all the matchups still being the same, you can get away with having a lot of the same main deck choices as last format. Things like Crackdown, Compulsory Evacuation Device, Lost Wind, things of that nature that can have good utility both going first and going second. We still have 3 Solemn Judgment, which is really good. And the fact that Striker is Geist's worst matchup, arguably, it's really good, because now with Striker being weakened, you can definitely expect to see Altergeist have better success against that deck, provided that there's not really floodgates that get flipped. Especially there can be only one. That's a really big problem for that deck. But Melisleek is still an out and Silk isn't out, so there's options for sure. There's very good snowball potential, again, inevitability. Once the ball gets rolling, it's really hard to stop, and you just have Protocol negations, Silk bounces, Hexia negates, and Conquery to just block attacks and just protect stuff. And you have cards being able to just cycle through every single turn. So you just have a lot of different ways to be able to choke out your opponent once you are able to set up. One of the biggest weaknesses is, especially what I found when I played the deck, and the last time I played it really was when Faker was still at 3, but you still have like really awkward openings at times where you have too many monsters, like maybe 3 Geist monsters, and that's not very good, or you have like all traps and no monsters, and that's also not very good. You need to have the right balance, and it's really hard to, you can't really cherry pick that, right? So you just have to hope that whatever you draw in your opener does get you there, and you can dictate the game based on what you have to start with. Like, it's very predictable as far as, as an Altergeist player, it's very easy to tell when to use your disruptions accurately or optimally based on your experience against the certain matchups. But like, you'll always be able to dictate the pace of the game if you get to go first, set up, and have a very nice hand. But there's a lot of awkward openings that kind of just are counterintuitive to that idea. There's also a lot of side deck hate. Twin Twister Red Reboot, if Evenly Matched comes in the format at any point, that's another card. Pancratops. There's a lot of cards that are really good against this deck, and that also can definitely shut it down. So that's another downfall of Altergeist that you might want to consider. The next deck I have is Pendulum, which you might argue did get like directly hit with Agripane, but I would argue Agripane actually did very little for the deck as far as hitting it. You just go back to play maybe more Magicians or like just level 7 Pendulums, and you just make Absolute Dragon and you can go into Vortex that way. LP itself actually is still a very big deal because it gets to shoot it for the Dragster play. Some people, aka Triff, are experimenting with Tempest, which is a pretty cool extender. It allows you to kind of just get an additional body on the board to either help you make Seal. Like when you go LP plus Triple Burst into Romulus, that's a really nice way to search another extender. So this deck definitely plays very much almost the same. That's why I kind of lump it into the same group as Geist, where like they both kind of just do the same thing as they would have done previously with not really much net change. I do think this deck, maybe I'm still overrating it a little bit much, but I still think it should be one of the bigger contenders, especially with, Orcust and Striker going down a peg. It has obviously some of the highest ceiling boards. It's very nice to just be able to auto win some games just for playing your deck. So that's pretty cool. And it's very safe while doing so because of the existence of Jackal King, obviously, with Servants. So you just play around Nibiru, play around all the other hand traps except Impermanence. But, if they have Nibiru Impermanence, then they're pretty nice. Board breakers can, though, hurt the deck at times. Like in Pendulum Mirrors, for example, you'll see a lot of the times that the side deck really comes down to who drew their Super Poly or Lava Golem or Sphere Mode or whatever. So just be wary of that. The fact that there are still, blowout cards that really can't be interacted with very well. In the case of Super Poly, just can't be interacted with at all. In the case of Lava Golem and Sphere Modes, those can't really be well dealt with. So yeah, just bear that in mind that those are still issues that you might have to face. And Floodgates, when the deck is forced to go second, really can hurt. Even like, Solemn Strikes or just point disruptions can be an issue, but Summon Limit can hurt a lot, and Imperial Order and especially Anti-Spell Fragrance, if people start picking up on that again, those are just very hard cards for the deck to deal with. So next up we got Cyber Dragon, which did get a nerf on this list. So now we're going to talk about the decks that got nerfed, so like for sure, but aren't going to, I don't think, occupy that tier 1 space as much. So first we have Cyber Dragon, which is completely unplayable as an Orcust strategy anymore. It's not really, there's no real synergistic ways to utilize it outside of just Mermaid bridging it together. So a little unfortunate. It is cool, like Nashor bring back Nagirsu, but like, the problem is getting to the Orcust engine at all at this point. But you still have two very viable options. The first being a blind second OTK build, which is like, I would say, traditional Cyber Dragon, and the second is the Control Cyber Dragon build, similar to Yassine's build from Top 8 YCS Niagara. That really sparked a lot of sort of ideas for this deck as far as Overflow being a trap trickable target, and you can just play a lot of cards that are really good at breaking boards, building them, similar to the Altergeist mentality, and just playing fewer Cyber Dragon names in general, enough to break boards, enough to continually get advantage generation with hers and stuff, continually getting you back like Cyber Dragons and stuff. But overall, with the Control Cyber Dragon variant, I think that's pretty cool because you're able to, again, be as flexible as something like an Altergeist, but you have the added benefit of being able to just clear boards going second almost for free as long as they're monster boards. And speaking of which, that's the next point here. Mega Fleet really deals with monster heavy boards very, very well with its natural engine. It's any Cyber Dragon monster, which is like really, really good. So you can cut down on copies of OG Cyber Dragon and just play like the cores and the Herzes and like Nashter and stuff. So that's pretty cool. It's also really good against Orcust, where you can just banish all the machines, not banish, but contact freeze away all the machines with the Chimera Tech Fortress Dragon, which is a very, very solid answer to just any Crescendo or Babel setups like on their own, which I think is very, very unique sort of appeal. Additionally, it is kind of difficult, however, to adapt to the deck's weak side depending on what deck that you pick. So if you pick the blind second build, it's going to be hard to go first and make any sort of board. Meanwhile, if you go second with a lot of traps, you're not actually playing a lot of hand traps, so it's pretty bad against like combo decks if you do choose to go that route. But something to consider. I'm not a big Cyber Dragon expert, but these are just my preliminary thoughts. And control matchups I feel are kind of awkward for at least the controller Cyber Dragon matchup. Maybe not so much the blind second build, because you know there's like Rampage and everything. And you know obviously the control Cyber Dragon build still does play Rampage because it is so focused on overflow. Just wants to recycle stuff back and get a lot of pops. But at the same time, going second with auto traps is never really, you know, that fun of a feeling. And that's kind of all I have to say about Cyber Dragon, actually. So next up we have Lunalite, which, welcome to my channel. That is the primary audience of my channel. I already made an entire video dedicated to what happened if Mermaid would get banned, which is what happened, and I didn't expect. I was hoping that nothing else would happen, and nothing else did. So I think Orcust is neutered. It's obviously not entirely killed because of Curious, but I really think that Curious into sending it an Orcust monster, if you have very, very little follow-up, is not very great. Like, you have to use Curious and the symbol that you summon off Harp to make a Galatea. If you want to make a second Galatea, you need another monster, so it's taking away more extenders, and you're giving up like 4 monsters to do the Orcust combo instead of 2, so you're gonna always be behind on monsters essentially. And I think that's really, really, really bad for, just as far as creating like a solid potent turn 1 board. But pure variants might actually be viable again. I did mention in yesterday's video that I'm not a big fan of the blind second list, but you can definitely try it out, and it can still definitely work if you were able to find pretty good ideas that I maybe didn't think of. But I do think build a board style decks for Lunalites are for sure still viable. Even without Orcust, you just have to play a little bit smartly and decide what to include as far as your disruptions are concerned. I think that the deck obviously has a hard time against floods. There can be only one, and especially Summon Limit are really, really hard to deal with. And if those cards pick up in popularity in decks like Striker or even Orcust for Summon Limit, or things of that sort, it's going to be hard for the deck to really, really compete on a high macro level. I feel like this is maybe just me, but a lot of the boards I felt were just kind of underwhelming, at least for the whole field. So there's too much control and too much combo in the meta to where we can effectively combat it. So it might just be try and go one way. If they go the other way, then we just lose. But I really don't like that way of playing Yu-Gi-Oh! I mean, sometimes it's correct, but I prefer to avoid it if possible. And it's my favorite deck, so you should like it too. Thanks. Alright, next up is True Draco, and I don't have a whole lot to say about it. It's still consistent. You still got Demise, Desires, Duality, all these cards. It still does what it does. It has access to Floodgates, and the variety in Floodgates in this game allows you to kind of just, again, tailor it to whatever you need. You can play Anti-Spell for Pendulums if they come up. You can play, obviously, Rivalry. You can play Gozen, and there can be only one, which is very strong. You can play Summon Limit. You can play Erupt. You can play all these things, and it just basically does the same thing it does every single format. So I'm not going to explain too much on it. It's not really good to be able to suit hand traps, so it struggles against combo going second for sure. It's also blown out, similar to Altergeist, by the side deck cards. It can be easier or harder to recover than Geist, depending on what you keep and depending on what else you have and what a Geist player would theoretically have. But it is still hard to recover. And I think going second, Jessica Cotton actually talked about this in an interview with Team Samurai, but the Draco engine just gets less of value when you go second and try and tribute them off and pop things because of Balinxes, Colossuses, and Girsus. So it's not looking that great for the True Draco spells and traps, but overall the deck is still pretty functional and does what it does. The next deck I have is Subterra Guru Control, and I'm gonna be honest, I was running out of time to make this video. Like, it's already been going on a bit long as far as like editing it and recording it. So not gonna bother. I am just going to say see True Draco. A lot of the same comments apply. Not all of them, of course, but is consistent, is able to access floodgates and have a lot of disruptions, but it can be weak to, you know, just not opening the right cards against combo or things of that nature. It can play hand traps, which is pretty cool, so it is something to look out for, but generally these decks are pretty similar in what they and how they function. And the final deck that I want to talk about right now is Gren Maju, as this deck did win a YCS. Shout out to Mendoza for my team. But yeah, this deck always will have a surprise factor because it's represented and underrated. So like you always be able to catch people off surprise and just cheese wins that way. It's really good with Gizmic, of course, and it's just a good answer to a lot of decks that don't really have a way to beat it. And what the meta plays doesn't really affect the way this deck overall works. You just have to find the best like 10 or 15 or however many non-engine side spots there are, and just try and optimize it that way. It is very much not good going first. That's pretty much all I have to say about that. It's pretty self-explanatory. And it is kind of weak to effect negation. Granted, there's only one Widow Anchor now, but there is still impermanence and like Veilers and stuff. And your opponent might swing back for no decay the following turn after clearing your board. So it's very important that like if you're committing to the board, you just have to kill them. And then finally, we got the tier list, which is very tentative, but yeah, I'm just gonna put it on screen right now. So these are just my preliminary thoughts. Don't sue me, please. So in tier 1, I have Thunder, Salad, Orcust, and Pendulum, which I sort of hesitate to put again in this tier 1, but I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt again, just because I feel like in general, in a vacuum, that deck should be super insanely strong. These are not necessarily in any particular order, but they are there. In tier 1.5, I have Striker, and then I have Lunalite, variants in general, Geist, oops. So like these are the decks that can kind of hold their own, but I don't think it will consistently take games unless you have a very skilled pilot. And especially in the case of Lunalite, like right now, because it's a lot harder to actually combo off, you have to have a really good player playing the deck. Then tier 2, we have Draco, which you already saw a preview of, Cyber Dragon variants, Guru, and then oh, now you're gonna see the rogue picks. So like I think these decks all have one thing in common, and it's that there's a weakness that can be exploited. Like for example, Cyber Dragon Pure's weakness to going first, or like you know, the other Cyber Dragon build just not having, like, you're putting a lot of resources into it as far as not getting a whole lot of payoff for it, but it's fine. Then you have like generally just things that are strong when they get their engines intact and when they work, but when they don't work, you kind of just feel a little bit sad, or when you brick or get like evenly matched, or you know, your board gets wiped. But that's kind of just the nature of playing Yu-Gi-Oh, especially with rogue decks. Speaking of rogue decks, we got them right here. Just some of them, not all of them, but this is like the tier of rogue that I would expect. Still respectable decks, especially at a regional level, but just to be sure that you won't see them extremely often. But that's going to be it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I've been so busy recording lately, and I am super tired right now. I'm going to bed right after this. But thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know if you did enjoy by leaving a like if you did, as well as any thoughts or feedback in the comment section down below. Feel free to hit the subscribe button if you want to see more informative and competitive Yu-Gi-Oh content. If you want to, you can follow me on Discord, Twitter, or Twitch. All 3 links are going to be in the description as always. And once again, thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll catch you in the next video. See you guys!